The story does not begin with movement, or sound, or anything that announces itself as important. It begins with absence, with a quiet so complete that it almost feels like nothing is there at all. The earth exists, but not in any way that feels familiar. There are no forests, no creatures, no voices carried across air. There is only a surface that shifts slowly beneath dim skies, and oceans that have not yet learned how to reflect life back at themselves. It stretches backward, beyond memory, beyond imagination, into a time that does not behave like time as it is known now. Moments do not pass in seconds or minutes, but in spans so vast they seem to dissolve meaning. A single change may take millions of years, yet nothing appears to hurry, nothing appears to pause. Everything unfolds in a rhythm that feels distant, almost unreachable, as though the planet is moving through a kind of silence that cannot be measured. In this stillness, the first oceans begin to gather, not as something dramatic, but as a quiet accumulation. Vapor cools, condenses, and falls, again and again, until vast bodies of water settle into place. They are not blue in the way they are seen today. They are darker, heavier, carrying elements that make them feel more like something unfamiliar than something inviting. Beneath their surface, chemistry begins to stir, not with intention, but with persistence. Land does not remain still either. Massive plates shift beneath the surface, colliding, separating, reshaping what little structure exists. Continents are not fixed forms, but fragments in motion, drifting without direction, without awareness. The sky above is different as well, thick with gases that would feel alien to breathe, filtering light into tones that do not resemble the colors known now. Nothing settles into permanence. Everything feels as though it is in the process of becoming something else. And yet, within this quiet, something begins that will eventually change everything. Not suddenly, not in a way that can be seen, but in traces so small they would pass unnoticed even if someone were there to witness them. Simple interactions, molecules meeting, separating, rearranging, repeating patterns that do not seem important at first, but they continue, they repeat. And over spans of time that are almost impossible to hold in thought, they begin to form something that resembles the earliest hint of life. This is where the story begins to shift, almost imperceptibly, because what is often described as a simple beginning may not be simple at all. These early processes do not move in straight lines from chaos into order. They form networks, cycles, interactions that seem to stabilize and transform their surroundings at the same time. It is here that a quiet question starts to emerge, one that does not demand attention, but lingers beneath everything that follows. Everything that is understood about this world comes from fragments, from traces preserved in stone, from chemical signatures interpreted long after they formed. Nothing is observed directly. Nothing is remembered. It is reconstructed, carefully, piece by piece. And yet each piece carries uncertainty. What appears clear may only be the simplest version of something far more complex, something that does not fully reveal itself through the evidence that remains. And so the silence is no longer empty. It is filled with processes that cannot be fully seen, with beginnings that do not feel like beginnings, and with a world that may not fit the story often told about it. The deeper this quiet is considered, the more it seems to hold back, as though something essential remains just out of reach. It leaves behind a lingering sense that this early Earth was not merely a simpler version of what exists now, but something far more unfamiliar, something that may still be misunderstood, even in the most careful attempts to explain it. And as this realization settles, the stillness does not fade. It deepens, revealing that beneath this calm surface, something has already begun. The silence does not remain empty for long. Something begins to take shape within it, not as a sudden event, but as a quiet arrangement of processes that seem almost too organized for such an early world. Beneath the dark surface of ancient oceans, interactions repeat with a consistency that feels unusual, as though the planet is beginning to form patterns long before it should be capable of doing so. At first, these patterns are subtle. Chemical elements move through the water, reacting, separating, and recombining in cycles that do not immediately reveal their significance, but they persist. They do not dissolve back into randomness. Instead, they begin to connect, forming chains of interaction that influence one another. One reaction alters the conditions for the next, which in turn shapes another, until something resembling a system begins to emerge. It is here that the first living structures appear, though they do not resemble life as it is commonly imagined. Microbial communities spread across shallow seas, forming thin layers that grow slowly over time. They do not move in visible ways, yet they are not passive. They interact constantly with their surroundings, drawing in elements, releasing others, subtly changing the chemistry of the water around them. Over long stretches of time, they begin to build. Stromatolites rise from these interactions, not as deliberate constructions, but as the result of countless repetitions. Layer upon layer forms, each one shaped by the presence of life that is too small to see, yet powerful enough to leave lasting structures behind. They appear almost architectural, as if designed, though no intention guides them. Their presence suggests something difficult to ignore. Organization has already begun. The ocean itself begins to change in response. Gases dissolve and are released in different proportions. The atmosphere above slowly shifts, influenced by processes taking place far below the surface. What once seemed like a collection of separate reactions now starts to resemble something interconnected, as though life and environment are shaping each other at the same time. This is where the sense of unease begins to deepen, because these systems do not behave like simple beginnings. They do not move gradually from disorder into complexity in a clear, predictable way. Instead, complexity seems to appear almost immediately, woven into the earliest stages of life. The boundaries between organism and environment blur, forming feedback loops that maintain balance in ways that feel almost coordinated. It becomes difficult to describe these processes as accidental, not because they are guided by intention, but because their consistency suggests structure. The same patterns repeat across different regions, across different conditions, as though certain rules are already in place. And yet, those rules are not fully understood. They are inferred from what remains, from traces left behind in stone and chemistry, but the full picture remains incomplete. Everything known about these early systems is reconstructed from fragments. There is no direct observation, no memory of how these processes unfolded in real time. What remains are the results, preserved across vast stretches of time, hinting at interactions that may have been far more intricate than they appear now. Each discovery adds detail, but also raises new questions, as though every answer reveals something deeper that cannot yet be explained. And so a quiet tension forms beneath the surface of the story. If such organized systems existed so early, then the assumption that complexity emerges slowly begins to weaken. It suggests that Earth may not have followed a simple path from chaos into order, but instead began with forms of balance that were already advanced in ways that are still difficult to fully grasp. The more closely these systems are considered, the more they seem to resist simple explanation. They hold together, they adapt, they persist, yet they do so in environments that should not easily support stability. It leaves behind a lingering question, one that does not resolve itself, but continues to expand. And as these early systems settle into place, appearing stable on the surface, another possibility begins to emerge, quieter still, suggesting that beneath this apparent balance, something far less predictable may already be waiting to unfold. The balance does not hold. What appeared, for a moment, to resemble order, begins to shift, then unravel, then form again in a different shape. The early Earth does not settle into stability. It resists it. Beneath the quiet systems that seem to emerge, something far more restless is already in motion, reshaping the planet in ways that do not follow a steady path. The oceans change first, though the shift is not immediate. Their chemistry drifts over time, slowly at first, then more abruptly, as new elements are introduced and others disappear. Waters that once supported certain forms of life become hostile to them, while elsewhere, new conditions open unexpected possibilities. There is no fixed state, no moment where the environment pauses long enough to be defined. It is always becoming something else. Above, the atmosphere behaves in a similar way. Gases accumulate, then thin, then shift again under the influence of forces both internal and external. The sky itself is unstable, filtering light in ways that change over time, altering the conditions below. What reaches the surface is not constant. It fluctuates, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, creating environments that are never quite the same from one age to the next. The land offers no refuge from this uncertainty. Continents move, collide, fracture, and reform in cycles that stretch across immense spans of time. Volcanic activity releases heat and gases into the air and sea, altering conditions without warning. Entire regions transform, not gradually, but through sudden shifts that redefine the environment entirely. Nothing remains fixed long enough to become permanent. And yet, life does not disappear within this instability. It continues. It adapts. It persists in ways that seem difficult to reconcile with the conditions surrounding it. Organisms emerge that can endure extremes of temperature, chemistry, and pressure that would seem impossible by modern standards. They do not simply survive despite the instability. In many ways, they exist because of it. This is where the story begins to turn. Because instability is often seen as something that must be overcome, a barrier to progress, a force that disrupts growth. But here, in this early world, it behaves differently. Each shift creates new conditions, and within those conditions, new forms of life begin to take shape. What disappears in one moment is replaced by something else in the next, not as a repetition, but as a variation. The cycles of change begin to resemble something more than random disruption. They create opportunities, forcing life to adjust, to transform, to explore possibilities that would not exist in a stable environment. What seems destructive on the surface becomes, over time, a source of diversity. Each fluctuation introduces new pathways, new combinations, new forms that would not emerge in a world that remained unchanged. It becomes increasingly difficult to separate chaos from creation. The same forces that erase entire systems also allow new ones to form. The same instability that makes survival uncertain also drives adaptation in unexpected directions. Life does not wait for balance to return. It moves with the changes, reshaping itself again and again. And so the idea of stability begins to dissolve. It no longer appears as the goal toward which everything is moving. Instead, it becomes something temporary, something that exists only between shifts, never lasting long enough to define the system as a whole. The planet does not settle. It continues to fluctuate, to transform, to resist any final state. What emerges from this is a quiet realization, one that changes the way the entire early Earth is understood. Perhaps it was never meant to be stable. Perhaps the constant movement, the shifting conditions, the unpredictable changes were not obstacles, but essential parts of the process. Not interruptions, but the very mechanism through which life expanded into forms that would not otherwise exist. And if this is true, then the life that emerges from such a world may carry that instability within it, shaped by forces that do not favor permanence. It suggests that the creatures of this time and the ecosystems they inhabit may not resemble anything familiar, and that the world they belong to may be far stranger than anything that has been imagined so far. The world that emerges from instability does not resemble anything familiar. Life begins to take form, but not in the way it is often imagined. There are no clear lineages, no recognizable shapes that connect easily to what exists today. Instead, the oceans fill with organisms that seem to follow rules no longer visible, as though evolution itself was once moving through possibilities that have since been forgotten. They appear quietly, without announcement, spreading across ancient seas that are still shifting in chemistry and light. Many are soft-bodied, leaving behind only faint impressions, fragile traces that hint at their presence but never fully reveal it. Their forms are difficult to define. Some stretch outward in radial patterns, symmetrical in ways that do not align with the structures seen in most modern life. Others seem almost formless, expanding and contracting with no clear boundary, as though they exist somewhere between shape and fluid. There is something deeply unfamiliar in their design. They do not resemble early versions of creatures known today. They do not appear as simpler ancestors waiting to become something more complex. Instead, they exist as complete forms, adapted to their environment in ways that feel intentional, yet remain difficult to explain. Their bodies do not follow a single pattern. Some lack clear heads or tails, others do not display bilateral symmetry, and many seem to challenge the idea that life must organize itself in predictable ways. It becomes increasingly difficult to place them within any structured path of evolution. They do not fit neatly into categories, and attempts to classify them often reveal more uncertainty than clarity. Each discovery suggests variation rather than continuity, as though life at this stage was exploring multiple directions at once, without committing to any single outcome. The oceans become a landscape of experimentation. Life spreads across surfaces, attaches itself to shifting environments, and adapts in ways that seem both stable and temporary at the same time. Entire communities form and dissolve, replaced by others that follow different patterns, different structures, different approaches to survival. There is no single dominant form, no clear progression from one stage to the next. Instead, there is diversity without resolution. This raises a question that lingers beneath every observation. These organisms are often described as primitive, as early attempts at complexity that would later refine into more advanced forms. But the more closely they are considered, the less certain that description becomes. Their structures are not necessarily simple. They are unfamiliar. They represent a kind of organization that does not align with what came after, but that does not make them incomplete. It suggests that complexity may not move in a straight line, that what is seen today is not the inevitable result of what existed then, but only one of many possible outcomes. These early life forms may not be unfinished versions of something greater. They may be remnants of paths that were once fully realized, but later disappeared, leaving no direct continuation. There is a quiet sense that something has been lost, not in terms of information, but in terms of possibility. Entire ways of existing, entire structures of life, may have once thrived and then vanished, leaving behind only fragments that hint at their existence. What remains is not enough to fully reconstruct them, only enough to suggest that they were there, and that they followed rules that no longer apply. As these forms spread across the ancient oceans, they do not exist in isolation. Their presence begins to influence the environment itself, altering conditions, reshaping interactions, creating feedback that extends beyond individual organisms. The boundary between life and planet begins to blur even further, suggesting that what is unfolding is not just evolution within an environment, but a deeper process where both are changing together in ways that are only beginning to be understood. The strangeness of individual life forms does not remain isolated for long. It expands outward, shaping entire ecosystems that feel as unstable as the creatures within them. These are not balanced environments in the way they are often imagined today. They are fragile, uneven, and filled with conditions that seem as though they should erase life rather than support it. In many regions, the oceans carry little oxygen, far less than what most modern organisms would require. Waters become dense with dissolved metals and chemicals that would be toxic in familiar environments. Layers form within the sea, separating zones that behave almost like different worlds stacked upon one another. In some depths, conditions shift so drastically that movement between layers would mean immediate change, immediate pressure on any form of life attempting to cross. And yet, life does not retreat. It remains, adapting to these conditions in ways that do not follow the expectations formed from the present. Microbial communities dominate certain regions, forming the foundation of food webs that appear delicate, almost too fragile to persist. Energy flows through these systems slowly, carefully, as though any disruption could bring everything to an end. But the disruption does not come, at least not in the way it might be expected. These ecosystems endure. They persist across spans of time that extend far beyond what such conditions would seem to allow. Generations of life continue within them, maintaining cycles that appear to balance on the edge of collapse, yet never fully falling apart. This persistence begins to feel unusual, because these environments are not stable in the traditional sense. Their chemistry shifts, their boundaries change, and the organisms within them are constantly adjusting. There is no clear equilibrium, no fixed state that holds everything in place. Instead, there is a kind of moving balance, one that adapts continuously without ever settling. It suggests that survival here does not depend on stability, as it is commonly understood. Instead, it depends on the ability to respond, to adjust, to exist within change rather than resist it. The systems do not hold together because they are unchanging. They hold together because they are constantly shifting in ways that maintain their overall structure. This introduces a deeper question, one that lingers beneath the surface of every observation. Why do these ecosystems persist at all? Why do they not collapse under the weight of their own instability? The conditions suggest fragility, yet the duration suggests resilience. The contradiction remains unresolved, creating a quiet tension that does not easily fade. Perhaps the answer lies not in the organisms themselves, but in the interactions that connect them. Each part of the system influences the others, creating loops of response that adjust to changes as they occur. A shift in one area triggers adjustments in another, spreading through the system in ways that maintain continuity even as conditions fluctuate. But even this explanation feels incomplete, because the consistency of these responses suggests something more than simple reaction. It hints at underlying patterns, at structures that guide how these ecosystems adapt without being directly visible. These patterns are not fully understood. They are inferred from what remains, from the persistence of systems that should not have lasted as long as they did. Everything known about these environments comes from fragments, from traces preserved in layers of rock and chemical signatures that hint at conditions long gone. They reveal enough to suggest complexity, but not enough to fully explain it. Each piece adds to the picture, yet the full structure remains just out of reach. And so the contradiction remains. Ecosystems that appear unstable continue to endure. Conditions that should prevent life instead sustain it. The rules that define survival begin to feel less certain, less universal, as though they may have been different in ways that are not fully understood. As this realization settles, another thought begins to form, quieter but more persistent. If these systems could maintain themselves under such unlikely conditions, then their persistence may not be accidental. It suggests that something deeper is at work, something shaping these environments beyond simple chance, something that connects their instability to their survival in ways that have yet to be fully uncovered. The instability remains, and the strange ecosystems continue to endure, but something else begins to surface beneath them. It is not immediately visible. It does not announce itself through a single discovery or a clear pattern that can be easily followed. Instead, it appears gradually, through small connections that begin to align in ways that feel more than coincidental. Across different regions, separated by vast distances and spans of time, similar structures begin to emerge. Certain forms repeat, not exactly, but with enough resemblance to suggest that they are shaped by the same underlying influences. Organisms that share no direct lineage display comparable symmetries. Ecosystems that exist under different conditions respond to change in similar ways. It is as though something is guiding the possibilities, narrowing the paths that life can take without ever determining them completely. At first, these similarities seem easy to dismiss. Evolution is often understood as a process shaped by environment and chance, where repeated conditions can lead to repeated outcomes. But the deeper the patterns are examined, the less they feel like simple repetition. They appear across conditions that are not identical, across systems that should not necessarily produce the same results. This is where the sense of randomness begins to shift. Because randomness, when observed over time, does not usually produce consistent structures. It produces variation, divergence, unpredictability. And yet, within the ancient world, there are moments where variation seems to circle back toward familiar forms, as though certain arrangements are favored, even when the surrounding conditions differ. The connection between life and environment becomes more difficult to separate. Changes in atmospheric composition align with shifts in biological complexity. Variations in ocean chemistry coincide with the emergence of new structural patterns in organisms. These events are not perfectly synchronized, but they overlap in ways that suggest influence rather than coincidence. Still, nothing here provides a complete explanation. Each pattern is partial, each connection incomplete. The evidence does not form a clear system that can be defined with certainty. Instead, it forms a network of suggestions, hints that something deeper may be shaping the direction of life without being directly observable. It raises a question that lingers quietly beneath the surface. If these patterns exist, what is creating them? Not in terms of intention, not as a force that chooses outcomes, but as a set of conditions or constraints that guide what is possible and what is not. Something that does not control evolution, but shapes its boundaries in ways that are not yet fully understood. The idea is subtle, almost easy to overlook. It does not replace the role of adaptation or environmental pressure. Instead, it adds another layer beneath them, suggesting that evolution may operate within a framework that is more structured than it appears. That certain pathways emerge again and again, not because they are chosen, but because they are the natural result of deeper principles at work. These principles are not clearly defined. They are glimpsed through patterns that repeat without fully revealing their source. They exist in the alignment between change and response, between instability and persistence, between the diversity of life and the recurring structures that appear within it. Everything that has been seen so far begins to shift under this perspective. The strange life forms, the unstable ecosystems, the unexpected resilience, all of it starts to feel less like a series of disconnected events and more like parts of a larger system that is not yet fully visible. The chaos does not disappear, but it begins to carry a sense of structure beneath it. And this realization changes the way the early Earth is understood. It is no longer just a place where life emerged through chance and adaptation. It becomes something more complex, a system where patterns exist without being fully explained, where order and disorder coexist in ways that blur the line between them. The deeper this idea settles, the more it begins to expand beyond life itself. Because if these patterns shape organisms and ecosystems, then they may also extend into the planet as a whole. And as that possibility begins to take form, the focus of the story shifts, moving outward toward the forces that shape not just life, but the entire Earth, in ways that may still be unfolding even now. The patterns that seem to guide life do not exist in isolation. They extend outward, beyond organisms and ecosystems, into the deeper workings of the planet itself. Beneath the surface, far below the oceans and continents, something is always moving. It does not announce itself. It does not pause. It exists as a constant flow of energy, rising slowly from within the Earth, shaping everything above it in ways that are rarely seen. Heat builds in the depths, generated by processes that began long before life appeared. It moves upward, through layers of rock, sometimes gently, sometimes with sudden force. When it reaches the surface, it does not arrive quietly. It breaks through, releasing gases, altering the air, reshaping the land. Volcanic eruptions become moments where the hidden interior reveals itself. But even when no eruption occurs, the movement continues, steady and unseen. The continents respond to this energy as well. Massive plates shift across the surface, driven by forces that cannot be observed directly. They move slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet their effects are immense. Landmasses collide, separate, rise, and sink, altering the shape of the planet over spans of time that stretch far beyond immediate awareness. Nothing remains fixed. Everything is part of a system that is constantly adjusting. Above the surface, another set of forces begins to interact with these changes. The atmosphere, already unstable, becomes a medium through which energy flows in different forms. Radiation from space reaches the planet, filtered by gases that change over time. Magnetic fields shift and fluctuate, sometimes shielding the surface, sometimes allowing more of this energy to pass through. These interactions are subtle, but their influence extends across the entire system. None of these forces operate in isolation. Heat from below influences the atmosphere above. Changes in the atmosphere alter conditions in the oceans. The oceans, in turn, affect the chemistry of the land and the air. It becomes increasingly difficult to separate one process from another. Each is connected, part of a network that spans the entire planet, linking what is seen to what remains hidden. This begins to change the way the Earth itself is understood. It is no longer simply a place where life exists. It becomes something more active, more involved. The forces beneath the surface do not merely support life. They shape the conditions in which life can emerge, persist, and change. They redefine what is possible, not through intention, but through constant interaction. And yet, these forces remain largely invisible. They do not present themselves directly. They are known through their effects, through the changes they create over time. The shifting of continents, the transformation of the atmosphere, the variations in climate and chemistry, all of these are expressions of something deeper that cannot be fully observed. This introduces a quiet but powerful idea. If these hidden energies are responsible for shaping the environment, then they are also shaping the pathways available to life. They influence which conditions arise, which persist, and which disappear. In doing so, they may guide evolution in ways that are not immediately obvious, not by directing it, but by defining the boundaries within which it unfolds. The more this is considered, the less these forces appear random. Their interactions are complex, often unpredictable, but they follow patterns that repeat over time. Heat rises, plates move, fields shift, and the system responds. It is not chaos in the sense of complete disorder. It is a form of movement that carries structure, even if that structure is not fully understood. And as these invisible energies continue to move through the planet, they begin to leave traces, not only in the land and the atmosphere, but in the history of life itself, marking moments where change accelerates, where new forms emerge, and where the direction of evolution shifts in ways that suggest something deeper is at work. The forces beneath the surface do not always move quietly. There are moments when the balance shifts suddenly, when the steady flow of energy breaks into something far more violent. These moments do not arrive as isolated incidents. They emerge from the same processes that have been shaping the planet all along, but they unfold in ways that feel abrupt, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. Volcanic activity intensifies beyond gradual release. Vast regions of the Earth begin to fracture, opening pathways for enormous volumes of molten material to reach the surface. Gases pour into the atmosphere, altering its composition in ways that spread across the entire planet. The sky darkens, temperatures shift, and the conditions that once supported existing ecosystems begin to disappear. Elsewhere, impacts from space strike with sudden force. Objects that have traveled silently through vast distances collide with the Earth, releasing energy that transforms the environment in an instant. The surface changes, the atmosphere fills with particles, and light itself becomes altered. These events do not simply damage what exists, they redefine the conditions under which life must continue. At first, these moments appear as endings. Entire ecosystems collapse under the weight of rapid change. Organisms that once thrived find themselves unable to adapt quickly enough. The balance that held systems together begins to break, and for a time, it seems as though the planet is moving toward emptiness rather than renewal. But the story does not end there. What follows is not silence, but transition. In the absence of what once dominated, space begins to open. Conditions shift again, not back to what they were, but into something new. The environment stabilizes in different ways, carrying traces of what came before, but also introducing possibilities that did not previously exist. Life responds to this change, not immediately, but steadily. New forms begin to emerge, shaped by conditions that are no longer constrained by the systems that once defined them. The absence of previous structures allows for variation that would not have been possible otherwise. Evolution does not simply continue, it redirects, moving into pathways that were once closed. This is where the perception of catastrophe begins to change. These events are often understood as disruptions, as interruptions in the steady progress of life. But when viewed across longer spans of time, they begin to resemble something else. They create space. They remove limitations. They allow for transitions that would not occur within stable systems. Each collapse is followed by a reconfiguration. Each loss creates an opening. The cycles repeat, not in identical forms, but with a consistency that suggests they are not entirely random. Volcanic eruptions, atmospheric shifts, impacts from space, all appear at different moments, yet their effects share a common outcome. They reset conditions, altering the direction of life in ways that extend far beyond the immediate event. It becomes difficult to see these moments as purely destructive. They carry within them the possibility of change, of transformation that reaches deeper than surface damage. What disappears is replaced, not as a restoration, but as a variation. The system does not return to what it was. It moves forward into something else. This introduces a subtle but powerful idea. If these events are part of a repeating pattern, then they may not be interruptions at all. They may be integral to the way the planet develops over time. Not controlled, not directed, but embedded within the processes that shape the Earth itself. The more this possibility is considered, the more the events begin to align. They do not occur with perfect regularity, but they share connections that suggest underlying forces linking them together. The same energies that move beneath the surface, that shift continents and alter atmospheres, may also be responsible for these larger moments of transformation. And if that is the case, then destruction is not separate from creation. It is part of the same system, part of the same movement that reshapes the planet again and again. What appears as an ending becomes a beginning in another form, connected through processes that are still not fully understood. As this realization settles, another question begins to take shape, one that extends beyond individual events. If these catastrophes are connected, if they follow patterns that repeat across time, then something deeper may be linking them. something that moves beneath the surface of the planet and through the history of life, quietly shaping both in ways that are only now beginning to be considered. The destruction fades, but it does not disappear. It settles into the background, leaving behind traces that begin to align in ways that are not immediately obvious. What once seemed like isolated events, shifts in climate, sudden collapses, unexpected recoveries start to reveal connections that stretch across time, linking moments that at first appeared unrelated. Temperature rises, then falls, not in a straight progression, but in cycles that echo across different ages. Oceans change composition, then return to conditions that resemble what existed long before. Entire groups of organisms appear, vanish, and are followed by others that carry faint similarities, as though certain forms are revisited, though never exactly repeated. At first, these patterns are difficult to recognize. They are separated by vast spans of time, hidden within layers of rock and fragments of evidence that must be carefully interpreted. Nothing presents itself clearly. Nothing forms a complete sequence that can be followed from beginning to end. And yet, when viewed together, the fragments begin to suggest rhythm. It is not a simple rhythm, not something that repeats in predictable intervals. The timing shifts, the intensity changes, and the outcomes vary. But beneath these differences, there is a sense of recurrence, a feeling that certain types of events are not entirely random. They emerge, fade, and then return in altered forms, as though guided by conditions that arise again and again. This begins to change the way chaos is understood. What appears as disorder may not be without structure. The fluctuations, the disruptions, the transformations, all seem to follow pathways that, while complex, are not completely without pattern. The system moves, not toward a fixed state, but through cycles that reshape it continuously. The idea is subtle, almost difficult to hold on to, because it does not offer a clear rule or a defined system that can be easily explained. It exists in the overlap between events, in the way one change seems to echo another, even when separated by immense distances in time. It suggests that the planet may carry within it a kind of memory, not in the sense of awareness, but in the persistence of processes that repeat under certain conditions. Extinction events, once seen as singular catastrophes, begin to resemble points within a broader sequence. Chemical shifts in the oceans align with atmospheric changes that occur at different moments, but produce similar effects. Even the emergence of new life forms appears to follow patterns that, while not identical, share underlying similarities. Still, nothing here provides certainty. The patterns are incomplete, open to interpretation, shaped by the limits of what can be observed. They do not form a definitive structure that can be proven beyond doubt. Instead, they exist as possibilities, as connections that feel meaningful without fully revealing their origin. This uncertainty does not weaken the idea, it deepens it. Because the absence of a clear explanation suggests that the system, if it exists, operates at a level that is not yet fully understood. It may not follow simple rules. It may not be something that can be easily measured or predicted. It may be a form of organization that exists within complexity itself. The more this possibility is considered, the more it begins to extend beyond the past. Because if these patterns shaped the early Earth, if they influenced the direction of life and the transformation of the planet, then they may not have ended. They may still be present, continuing in forms that are less visible, less dramatic, but no less significant. This introduces a quiet shift in perspective. The ancient world no longer feels entirely separate from the present. The events that shaped it do not remain confined to distant history. They become part of a system that continues to unfold, connecting past and present through processes that persist over time. And as this realization settles, another question begins to emerge, one that cannot be easily set aside. If these patterns exist, if they continue beneath the surface of what is seen, then how much of that ancient world is still here, hidden within the systems that shape the planet today, waiting to be recognized in ways that have not yet been fully understood? The past does not remain where it is expected. It does not stay locked within layers of rock or confined to distant ages that can only be imagined. Instead, parts of it continue, quietly, beneath the surface of the present, existing in places that rarely draw attention. The ancient world has not fully disappeared. It has simply become less visible. Far below the reach of sunlight, deep within the oceans, environments persist that feel closer to the earliest Earth than to anything familiar above. Here, light is absent, and yet life continues. It does not depend on the energy of the sun. It draws from chemical reactions occurring within the Earth itself, feeding on compounds released through cracks in the ocean floor. These ecosystems exist in isolation, separated from the surface world, sustained by processes that began long before complex life emerged. The conditions in these depths are extreme. Pressure builds to levels that would collapse most forms of life. Temperatures shift rapidly near vents where heat escapes from below. Chemicals that would be toxic in other environments become the foundation for survival here. And yet, life not only persists, it thrives, forming communities that operate according to rules that feel unfamiliar, almost ancient. These systems are not new. They are continuations of processes that existed in the earliest oceans, when sunlight was not the primary source of energy for life. They carry within them echoes of a time when the boundary between geology and biology was far less defined, when life emerged directly from the chemical interactions of the planet itself. The surface may appear to have moved beyond this stage, but beneath it, these older systems remain active. They exist as living fragments of a world that never fully ended, offering a glimpse into how life once functioned on a much larger scale. They do not dominate the planet as they once might have, but they have not vanished. The same pattern extends beyond the oceans. Deep beneath the land, within layers of rock that seem lifeless from above, microbial communities continue to exist. They survive in darkness, in isolation, relying on energy sources that do not depend on surface conditions. These organisms endure in environments that change slowly, almost imperceptibly, reflecting conditions that resemble those of the distant past. They are not relics in the sense of being frozen in time. They continue to adapt, to respond to subtle changes, to persist through conditions that would seem impossible. Their existence suggests continuity rather than separation, a thread that connects the earliest forms of life to those that exist now, even if that connection is not immediately visible. This challenges the idea that prehistoric Earth is something entirely gone, something replaced by a more advanced and stable world. Instead, it suggests that multiple layers of time coexist, that beneath the surface of what is seen today, older systems remain active, still following the same principles that shaped them long ago. There is something quiet but unsettling in this realization, because it means that the past is not as distant as it appears. It is not confined to history. It is present, ongoing, operating in places that are rarely considered, influencing the planet in ways that are not always recognized. These hidden systems become more than just curiosities. They are windows into processes that have never stopped, into forms of life and interaction that continue beneath the complexity of the modern world. They suggest that what has been observed so far is only part of the story, that other possibilities remain active, waiting to be understood. And as this idea settles, another question begins to form, one that extends beyond observation. If these ancient systems still exist, if they continue to operate under conditions that once defined the entire planet, then they may hold something more than memory. They may hold clues, not only about how life began, but about pathways that have yet to be explored, possibilities that have not yet been fully considered. The hidden systems beneath the surface offer a glimpse into something older, something still active, but they also reveal another truth that is quieter and more difficult to accept. Everything that is known about these systems, and about the ancient world as a whole, comes through interpretation. It is assembled carefully, piece by piece, from fragments that have survived across immense spans of time. And while this process has revealed much, it has never been complete. Science builds its understanding from what remains. Fossils, chemical signatures, geological layers, each one offering a clue, a trace of something that once existed. But these traces are never the full picture. They are partial, shaped by what was preserved and what was lost. Entire environments may have existed without leaving a clear record. Entire forms of life may have disappeared without a trace that can be easily recognized. The story that emerges from this evidence is detailed, structured, and carefully tested. It forms timelines, categories, explanations that bring clarity to what would otherwise feel unreachable. But beneath that clarity, there are gaps, spaces where the evidence becomes uncertain, where interpretations diverge, where different explanations attempt to describe the same fragment in different ways. These gaps are not flaws, They are part of the process. They reflect the limits of what can be known from what remains. Yet they also suggest something more. Because the absence of evidence is not the same as the absence of reality. It simply marks the boundary of what can currently be reconstructed. There are moments in Earth's history where transitions appear abrupt, where change seems to occur faster than the evidence can fully explain. There are structures that do not fit neatly into established categories, organisms that resist classification, patterns that are observed but not fully understood. These are not exceptions. They are reminders that the system being studied is more complex than any single model can fully capture. Over time, interpretations shift. New discoveries reshape old conclusions. What once seemed certain becomes open to revision. This is not a weakness of science, but one of its strengths. It allows understanding to evolve. But it also means that what is accepted now is not final. It is a current approximation, shaped by available evidence and the frameworks used to interpret it. This introduces a subtle but important possibility. What if the models used to describe prehistoric Earth are not just incomplete, but simplified? Not in a way that makes them incorrect, but in a way that smooths out complexity in order to make it understandable. What if the true nature of the ancient world was more intricate, more layered, than what can be fully expressed through current explanations? The idea does not reject what is known. It expands it. It suggests that beneath every explanation, there may be additional layers that remain unseen, not because they do not exist, but because they cannot yet be fully accessed. The evidence points in certain directions, but it does not close the system. It leaves it open, filled with possibilities that extend beyond what has been confirmed. There is a quiet tension in this realization. The more that is learned, the more it becomes clear that there is more that cannot yet be known. Each discovery reveals detail, but also reveals how much remains beyond reach. The boundaries of understanding do not disappear. They shift, moving outward, but always remaining present. And so the story of prehistoric Earth becomes something more than a completed narrative. It becomes a reconstruction in progress, shaped by fragments, guided by interpretation, and limited by what has survived. It is not fixed. It is not final. It continues to evolve as new pieces are found and new perspectives are applied. As this perspective settles, the sense of certainty begins to soften, not into confusion, but into openness. Because if understanding is limited, then the true nature of the ancient world may still exist beyond what has been assembled so far, waiting in places that have not yet been examined, or perhaps in forms that have not yet been recognized. The gaps in understanding do not always point to what is missing. Sometimes they point to what is already there, quietly present, waiting to be seen differently. Not everything about prehistoric Earth is hidden deep beneath layers of rock or lost to time. Some of it exists in plain sight, embedded within the very evidence that has already been studied. Geological formations stretch across landscapes, their patterns preserved with precision. Layers of sediment record shifts in environment, changes in chemistry, movements that occurred over spans of time too large to fully imagine. These formations are often read as timelines, as sequences that describe what happened and when. But within them, there are details that do not always align perfectly with the explanations built around them. Certain transitions appear too abrupt, as though something changed faster than expected. Some chemical signatures suggest conditions that seem inconsistent with surrounding layers. These are not errors. They are real, recorded in the structure of the Earth itself. Yet they are often explained in ways that fit within existing frameworks, interpretations that smooth over the irregularities rather than fully resolving them. Fossils carry similar uncertainties. Many forms of life appear suddenly within the record, without clear predecessors that show a gradual transition. Others display structures that do not fit neatly into established categories, combining features in ways that are difficult to trace through evolutionary pathways. These patterns are acknowledged, but often set aside as incomplete data, as gaps that will eventually be filled. But what if these are not gaps at all? What if they are signals, small indications that the systems shaping life and environment were more complex than they appear when viewed through simplified models? Each irregularity, each unexpected pattern, may not be an exception to the rule, but part of a structure that has not yet been fully recognized. Chemical traces preserved in ancient rock reveal interactions that are still being interpreted. Ratios of elements shift in ways that suggest processes occurring beneath the surface, processes that may not be fully explained by current understanding. These shifts are consistent enough to be real, but subtle enough to be overlooked, especially when they do not fit neatly into established narratives. It becomes easier, in many cases, to interpret these clues in ways that maintain continuity, that preserve the structure of what is already believed to be true. The mind seeks patterns that are familiar, explanations that align with what has already been accepted. But this tendency can also limit what is seen, narrowing the possibilities to those that feel most comfortable. The deeper these clues are considered, the more they begin to suggest that something larger may be present. Not in the sense of a hidden object or a single missing piece, but as a broader pattern that connects details that have already been observed. The evidence does not change. What changes is the way it is viewed. This shift in perspective is subtle, but it carries weight. It suggests that the story of prehistoric Earth may not be incomplete because evidence is missing, but because some of what is already known has not been fully interpreted. The pieces of the puzzle are there, but the image they form may not be the one that has been assumed. There is a quiet tension in this idea, because it does not rely on discovering something entirely new. It relies on seeing differently, on allowing the possibility that familiar evidence may hold meanings that have not yet been fully explored. It invites a reconsideration, not of what exists, but of how it is understood. As these fragments begin to align in new ways, the sense of certainty continues to soften. The ancient world becomes less defined, less contained within clear explanations. It begins to feel larger, more complex, more difficult to fully grasp. And as this perspective deepens, another possibility begins to emerge, one that feels both distant and close at the same time. If the clues have always been present, if the patterns have been visible but not fully recognized, then what they point toward may be something even more unexpected, suggesting that prehistoric Earth was not just different in degree, but different in nature, shaped by conditions that may feel almost alien when seen without the limits of familiar interpretation. The clues begin to gather into something more vivid, something that is no longer confined to fragments or patterns, but expands into an entire world that feels unfamiliar from the moment it is imagined. The Earth remains the same in name, the same in form, yet everything about its presence begins to shift into something that no longer resembles what is known today. The oceans are not clear, not open in the way they are often pictured. They are dense, filled with suspended particles and dissolved elements that give them a weight, a thickness that changes how light moves through them. Colors do not settle into blue. They drift through darker tones, sometimes green, sometimes almost metallic, reflecting conditions shaped by chemistry rather than clarity. Movement within these waters feels slower, heavier, as though the environment itself resists motion. The air above carries its own unfamiliar qualities. It is thicker in some moments, thinner in others, shaped by gases that alter not only what can be seen, but how everything is experienced. The sky does not hold a constant color. It shifts, sometimes muted, sometimes tinted with hues that feel slightly off, as though the light itself has been filtered through something unseen. What reaches the surface is not the same light that exists today. It changes the way landscapes appear, softening some forms, sharpening others, creating contrasts that feel unfamiliar. The land offers no stable reference. Surfaces stretch and fracture, shaped by forces that do not pause long enough to settle. Volcanic regions glow faintly in the distance, releasing heat that distorts the air above them. In other places, the ground feels dry, yet carries traces of chemical processes that continue beneath the surface. There is no single environment that defines the planet. Each region exists within its own set of conditions, shifting gradually or abruptly into something else. Even the sense of time within these environments feels altered. Change does not always announce itself. It happens slowly, then suddenly, then slowly again, creating a rhythm that does not follow a clear pattern. What appears stable may only be a temporary state, a moment between transformations that have not yet fully unfolded. There is something deeply unfamiliar in the way these elements combine. The ocean, the air, the land, all interact in ways that do not align with modern expectations. Chemical exchanges occur constantly, altering the environment from moment to moment. The boundaries between different systems blur, creating spaces where conditions overlap, where one environment transitions into another without clear separation. To exist within such a world, would not feel like standing on the same planet. The sensory experience would be different in ways that are difficult to fully imagine. The air would carry unfamiliar scents, shaped by gases and compounds that are no longer present in the same forms. The water would feel different against the surface, heavier, more reactive. The light would shift across the landscape in ways that change perception itself. This is not simply an earlier version of the Earth that exists now. It is something else entirely. A world that shares the same foundation, but expresses it in forms that feel distant, almost unrecognizable. The conditions that define it are not variations of the present. They are configurations that no longer exist in the same way, shaped by combinations of factors that have since transformed. The more this environment is considered, the more it begins to separate from familiar imagery. It becomes clear that the ancient Earth cannot be fully understood by adjusting what is known today. It requires a different perspective, one that allows for conditions that stretch beyond expectation, beyond what feels immediately possible. And as this unfamiliar world settles into view, another realization begins to emerge. If the environment itself was so different, if the very conditions of existence were shaped in ways that no longer persist, then the life within it would not simply adapt to what is known. It would evolve within a framework that may seem almost impossible when seen through the lens of the present. Within these unfamiliar environments, life does not follow a single direction. It branches, expands, and divides into forms that seem to test the limits of what is possible. The ocean becomes a place of constant variation, where structures appear, persist for a time, and then vanish without leaving a clear continuation behind. Each form exists as a complete expression of its moment, yet many do not extend into the future in ways that can be easily traced. Some organisms develop bodies that do not resemble anything seen today. Their structures are balanced in unusual ways, spreading outward instead of forward, lacking clear symmetry or direction. Others rely on interactions with their surroundings that feel entirely different from modern biological systems, drawing energy from processes that no longer dominate the surface of the planet. These forms are not incomplete. They are fully adapted to the conditions in which they exist, shaped precisely by environments that themselves will not remain. For a time, they thrive. Entire communities form around them, ecosystems built upon relationships that seem stable within their context. There is no indication, in these moments, that they are temporary. They do not appear as experiments that will fail. They appear as established systems, as dominant forms within their environments, fully integrated into the processes that sustain them. And yet, they do not continue. Conditions shift, sometimes gradually, sometimes with sudden force, and the pathways that once supported these forms begin to close. What once allowed them to exist no longer remains. The structures that define them become less effective, less suited to the new environment. Some attempt to adapt, to change along with the world around them, but not all can. Many fade, leaving behind only traces that hint at what once was. This is where the idea of progression begins to dissolve. Evolution is often imagined as a steady movement toward greater complexity, toward forms that build upon one another in a continuous line. But here, that line breaks into countless branches, many of which do not lead forward. They extend outward, explore possibilities, and then end. What remains is only part of what once existed. The life that continues into the present is not the sum of all that has been, but a selection, shaped by conditions that favored certain pathways over others. It does not represent the peak of what was possible. It represents what endured. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Because it suggests that other forms of life, equally complex in their own way, may have existed and then disappeared, not because they were less advanced, but because the conditions that supported them no longer remained. Entire systems, entire ways of existing, may have been lost, not through failure, but through change. This introduces a quiet sense of absence, a recognition that what is visible now is only a fragment of a much larger story. The forms that dominate today are not the only outcomes that could have been. They are one version among many, shaped by a sequence of events that narrowed the possibilities over time. It becomes possible to imagine a different world, one where certain paths continued instead of ending. A world where unfamiliar structures became the foundation for future complexity, where ecosystems evolved along trajectories that no longer exist. These possibilities are not entirely speculative. They are suggested by the fragments that remain, by the traces of forms that once thrived and then vanished. The more this is considered, the less evolution appears as a directed process. It becomes something broader, more open, shaped by forces that extend beyond simple adaptation. It explores, it branches, it creates variation without certainty of continuation. What survives is not necessarily what is most refined, but what aligns with the conditions that persist. And as this realization settles, another question begins to emerge, one that reaches beyond individual organisms. If evolution has explored so many paths, if it has produced forms that no longer exist alongside those that remain, then the forces guiding it may not be limited to environment alone. There may be deeper influences at work, shaping the possibilities in ways that are not yet fully understood. The fragments begin to settle, but they do not form a clear picture. Instead, they expand outward, connecting ideas that once seemed separate. The instability of the early Earth, the strange ecosystems that endured, the life forms that followed unfamiliar paths, and the patterns that appeared within apparent chaos, all of it starts to align into something that feels less like a sequence of events and more like a system that has yet to be fully understood. Nothing contradicts what has been seen. The evidence remains the same. But the way it fits together begins to shift. What once appeared as isolated phenomena now suggests continuity. What once seemed random begins to carry hints of structure, and what was thought to be simple, early, and incomplete starts to feel more complex, more layered than previously imagined. It becomes difficult to hold on to the idea that prehistoric Earth was merely a primitive version of the present. The conditions were different, the life was different, the processes were different in ways that cannot be reduced to gradual improvement over time. There is a growing sense that something more fundamental may have been at work, something that shaped the planet and its life in ways that are not fully captured by current explanations. The question emerges slowly, almost quietly, as though it has been present from the beginning but only now becomes clear enough to be noticed. What if the early Earth was not simply evolving toward what exists now, but operating under principles that no longer dominate the planet? This idea does not replace what is known. It sits beneath it, adding depth without removing structure. It suggests that the rules governing the ancient world may not have been identical to those observed today. Not entirely different, but influenced by conditions, interactions, and systems that have since shifted or faded. The patterns that appeared within chaos begin to take on new meaning. They may not have been accidental alignments. They may have been expressions of deeper constraints, frameworks that shaped how life and environment interacted. The instability that once seemed like a barrier may have been essential, not just for driving change, but for maintaining a system that required constant movement. Even the disappearance of certain life forms begins to feel less like failure and more like transition. Paths that once existed may have been tied to conditions that no longer remain, leaving behind only traces that hint at what was once possible. What survives today may not represent the full extent of what life can become, but only what has endured through a series of changes that narrowed the field of possibility. There is no clear answer waiting at the end of this question. It does not resolve into a single explanation. Instead, it opens outward, creating space for possibilities that extend beyond what can currently be confirmed. It invites a different way of thinking, one that does not seek to finalize the story, but to expand it. The past becomes less certain, but also more alive. It is no longer a fixed point that can be fully reconstructed. It becomes something dynamic, something that continues to influence how the present is understood. The deeper this idea settles, the more it begins to reshape the boundaries between what is known and what remains beyond reach. There is a quiet unease in this realization, but also a sense of clarity. Not clarity in the form of answers, but in the recognition that the story of Earth may be far deeper than it appears. That what has been uncovered so far may only be the surface of a much larger system, one that is still unfolding, still shaping the planet in ways that are not always visible. And as this question lingers, without resolution, it begins to lead the story forward. Because if the principles that shaped the ancient world have not fully disappeared, then they may still be present, still active, influencing the world in ways that have not yet been fully recognized. The question does not remain in the past. It follows forward, carried quietly into the present, where the same forces that shaped the early Earth continue to move beneath everything that appears stable. Nothing has truly stopped. The processes that once defined a world so unfamiliar have not disappeared. They have only become less visible, less dramatic, unfolding at a pace that feels almost still. Deep within the planet, heat continues to rise. It does not announce itself in most moments, yet it is always there, moving upward through layers of rock, influencing the surface in ways that are rarely considered. The ground beneath every landscape is not fixed. It shifts slowly, guided by movements that began long before any current form of life existed. Continents still drift, though the motion is too gradual to notice within a single lifetime. Mountains rise and erode, coastlines change, and the shape of the Earth continues to adjust, just as it always has. The oceans carry this motion as well. Currents move across vast distances, redistributing heat, shaping climates, influencing weather patterns that seem disconnected from anything beneath the surface. But these movements are not separate from the deeper forces. They are part of the same system, responding to shifts in temperature, pressure, and the structure of the planet itself. What appears as surface activity is tied to processes that extend far below. The atmosphere reflects these connections. Its composition changes over time, sometimes subtly, sometimes in ways that alter conditions across the entire planet. Gases cycle through different states, influenced by volcanic activity, biological processes, and interactions with energy from beyond the Earth. The air that surrounds the planet is not static. It is part of a continuous exchange, shaped by forces that have been active for billions of years. Even climate, often seen as something immediate and variable, carries traces of deeper patterns. Long cycles unfold over spans of time that are difficult to perceive directly. Temperatures rise and fall, not only due to surface conditions, but in response to interactions that connect the interior of the Earth, the oceans, and the atmosphere into a single, evolving system. What becomes clear is that the present is not separate from the past. It is a continuation. The same mechanisms that once created unfamiliar environments, that shaped strange ecosystems and guided the early forms of life, are still in motion. They have not reached an endpoint. They have not settled into permanence. They continue to adjust, to influence, to reshape the conditions of the planet. This realization carries a subtle shift in perspective. The world that feels stable is not truly fixed. It is balanced within a system that is constantly moving, constantly responding to forces that operate beyond immediate perception. The changes are slower now, less extreme in most moments, but they are still part of the same ongoing process. And within this continuity, another possibility begins to emerge. If these forces have not stopped, if they continue to shape the planet in ways that extend across time, then the conditions they create are not limited to the past. They may still be capable of producing environments that resemble those ancient states, not exactly the same, but influenced by the same underlying principles. The idea is quiet, almost easy to overlook, yet it lingers, because it suggests that the strange world that once existed has not fully vanished. It has transformed, shifted into forms that are less obvious, but still present within the systems that define the Earth today. And as this thought settles, it begins to extend further. If these forces remain active, if they continue to shape the planet beneath the surface of what is seen, then their influence may not end with the environment alone. They may still be shaping life itself, guiding changes that are too subtle to notice, but no less real. The forces beneath the planet continue to move, and life does not remain untouched by them. It responds, just as it always has, though the changes are no longer as visible as they once were. The surface of the world appears familiar, filled with ecosystems that seem stable, established, and complete. But beneath that appearance, something quieter is taking place, something that unfolds at a scale that rarely draws attention. In places far removed from everyday observation, life continues to adapt in ways that echo the distant past. Deep within the oceans, where sunlight does not reach, entire ecosystems thrive without relying on the energy that most life depends upon. Organisms draw from chemical reactions, sustaining themselves through processes that resemble the earliest stages of life on Earth. These systems do not feel like remnants. They feel active, evolving, responding to subtle changes in their environment. On land, similar patterns emerge in less visible forms. Microbial life exists in conditions that seem extreme, within rocks, beneath the surface, in environments where temperature, pressure, and chemistry would appear hostile to most organisms. These forms of life do not remain static. They shift, adapt, and evolve, often at rates that exceed what is observed in larger, more visible species. The changes are small, but they are constant. Genetic variations occur, responses to environmental pressures accumulate, and over time, these adjustments create differences that are not always immediately noticeable. Evolution continues, not as a dramatic transformation, but as a continuous process that moves quietly through populations, shaping them in ways that unfold gradually. Even within familiar ecosystems, adaptation is ongoing. Species adjust to changes in temperature, in chemical composition, in interactions with other organisms. These adjustments may seem minor, but they represent the same process that once drove the emergence of entirely new forms of life. The scale has changed, but the mechanism remains the same. What makes this difficult to perceive is the pace at which it occurs. In the early Earth, conditions shifted rapidly, forcing life to respond in ways that produced visible transformations. In the present, many changes unfold more slowly, blending into the background of what appears stable. The movement is still there, but it does not stand out. This creates a sense of stillness that may not truly exist. It suggests that evolution has slowed, that life has reached a point of relative completion. But this perception may be shaped by what is easiest to observe, by the forms of change that are large enough to be noticed within a short span of time. When attention shifts to smaller scales, to environments that are less visible, a different picture begins to emerge. Life continues to explore possibilities, to adjust to conditions that are always changing, even if those changes are subtle. It does not stop. It does not settle. It continues to move, just as it did in the earliest stages of its existence. This introduces a quiet but persistent idea. What if evolution has never paused? What if the same processes that once produced the unfamiliar forms of the ancient world are still active, still experimenting, but in ways that are not immediately visible? The difference may not be in the process itself, but in the way it is perceived. The boundary between past and present begins to soften under this perspective. The early Earth no longer feels like a separate stage that has been completed and left behind. It becomes part of an ongoing process, one that continues to unfold within the present, even if it does so beneath the surface of what is easily seen. And as this realization deepens, another layer begins to form. Because if life is still adapting in ways that mirror its earliest stages, then the distinction between what once was and what is now begins to blur, suggesting that something more continuous, more connected, is emerging beneath the surface of time itself. The changes remain subtle, almost invisible, yet they begin to gather into a realization that is difficult to ignore. The past does not sit behind the present as something completed. It does not remain contained within distant ages that can be separated from what exists now. Instead, it continues, layered beneath everything that appears current, woven into the same processes that shape the world today. The forces that moved the early Earth are still active. Heat continues to rise from deep within the planet. The surface continues to shift, slowly but without pause. Oceans circulate, the atmosphere changes, and life continues to adapt. None of these processes have ended. They have only changed in intensity, in visibility, in the way they are experienced. This continuity begins to dissolve the boundary that separates what is called prehistoric from what is called modern. The distinction relies on the idea that there was a clear transition, a point where one stage ended and another began. But the deeper these systems are considered, the less that division holds. There is no moment where the processes of the ancient world stopped and were replaced by something entirely new. Instead, there is only transformation. Conditions shift, forms change, but the underlying mechanisms persist. The same cycles that shaped early ecosystems continue to influence the present, even if they do so in ways that are less obvious. The same patterns that once guided the emergence of life still exist, embedded within systems that are now more complex, but not fundamentally different. Hidden ecosystems reinforce this connection. Deep beneath the surface, in environments that resemble the earliest Earth, life continues to operate according to principles that have never disappeared. These systems are not separate from the modern world. They exist within it, part of the same planet, influenced by the same forces that shape everything above. This creates a sense of continuity that extends beyond simple connection. It suggests that time itself may not be divided in the way it is often understood. The past does not end. It transitions, flows into the present, carrying with it processes that remain active. What is seen now is not a replacement, but an extension of what came before. The idea begins to shift perception in a subtle but powerful way. The ancient world is no longer distant. It is not something that exists only in reconstructions or fragments of evidence. It is present, not in its original form, but in the systems that continue to operate beneath the surface of what is visible. This introduces a question that changes the way the present is understood. If the processes of the past are still active, if the same forces continue to shape the planet and the life within it, then the distinction between past and present may be less meaningful than it appears. It may be a way of organizing time, rather than a reflection of how the system actually works. The realization does not arrive suddenly. It builds gradually, through the accumulation of connections that link what once seemed separate. Each observation adds to the sense that the world is not divided into stages, but exists as a continuous unfolding, where change is constant and boundaries are defined more by perception than by reality. There is something both calming and unsettling in this perspective. It removes the idea of a clear beginning and a clear end, replacing it with a process that continues without interruption. The story of the Earth does not move from one chapter to another in a clean sequence. It overlaps, extends, and evolves, carrying its past within its present at all times. And as this idea settles, it begins to extend forward as well. Because if the past has never fully left, if it remains active within the present, then the future may not be something entirely separate either. It may already be forming, shaped by the same forces, the same patterns, the same processes that have been unfolding all along. The sense of continuity begins to stretch forward, reaching into what has not yet happened. The past no longer feels fixed behind the present. It begins to feel like a reference, a set of patterns that continue to echo, not as exact repetitions, but as movements that return in altered forms. What once shaped the Earth may not be confined to what has already occurred. It may be part of a process that continues to unfold. Across the history of the planet, certain changes appear again and again. The climate shifts, sometimes gradually, sometimes with sudden intensity. Periods of relative stability give way to transitions that reshape entire environments. These changes do not follow a simple timeline, but they share similarities that suggest something deeper than coincidence. Oceans warm, then cool. Ice expands, then retreats. Chemical balances shift, altering the conditions that define ecosystems. These cycles do not repeat in identical ways, yet they carry a familiar structure. Each phase leads into another, forming sequences that extend across vast spans of time. Extinction events follow a similar pattern. They do not occur at regular intervals, but they emerge within the flow of change, often connected to shifts in environment that build over time. When they happen, they alter the direction of life, opening space for new forms to emerge. The outcome is never the same, but the process shares a recognizable rhythm. Geological transformations reflect this as well. Continents continue to move, not in isolation, but as part of cycles that reshape the surface of the planet. Land masses gather, separate, and reconfigure, influencing ocean currents, climate, and the distribution of life. These movements are slow, yet their effects extend far beyond what can be immediately observed. The more these patterns are considered, the more they begin to suggest that the Earth does not move randomly through its history. It follows pathways shaped by forces that interact over time, creating sequences that feel both unpredictable and familiar. The details change, the outcomes vary, but the underlying processes remain consistent. This introduces a quiet sense of inevitability, not in the sense that specific events are predetermined, but that certain types of change are bound to occur again. The system does not repeat itself exactly, but it revisits similar conditions, similar transitions, shaped by the same fundamental forces. The idea shifts the way the future is perceived. It is no longer something entirely unknown, detached from what has already happened. It becomes connected, influenced by patterns that have been unfolding for billions of years. The past does not dictate the future, but it offers clues, fragments of sequences that may continue in different forms. There is something both familiar and unsettling in this realization. Familiar because it suggests continuity, a sense that the world follows patterns that can be recognized. Unsettling because it implies that change is not always avoidable, that certain transitions may emerge regardless of whether they are expected. The environments that once existed, the conditions that shaped early life, may not be as distant as they seem. They may represent configurations that the planet can return to under the right circumstances. Not as exact replicas, but as variations that reflect the same underlying processes. This does not mean that the future is fixed. It remains open, shaped by countless interactions that continue to evolve. But it does suggest that the range of possibilities may be narrower than it appears, guided by patterns that have already been expressed in different ways. And as this idea settles, another question begins to take form. If these patterns can repeat, if the forces that shaped the ancient world are still active, then the conditions that once created unfamiliar ecosystems may return. Not in the same way, not in the same sequence, but in forms that may feel just as unexpected, just as difficult to recognize, emerging from processes that have never truly stopped. The patterns do not remain abstract. They begin to suggest images, possibilities that extend forward into environments that have not yet fully formed. The same forces that once shaped the ancient Earth continue to move, and as they do, they carry the potential to reshape the planet again, not into something entirely new, but into variations of states that have already existed in different forms. The atmosphere, always in motion, may shift in ways that alter how light reaches the surface. Changes in its composition could soften or intensify the colors of the sky, filter radiation differently, and reshape the balance between warmth and cooling. These changes would not arrive all at once. They would unfold gradually, building over time, until the environment begins to feel unfamiliar, not because it is entirely different, but because it has moved away from what is currently expected. The oceans follow a similar path. Their chemistry is not fixed. It responds to shifts in temperature, in atmospheric composition, in the movement of the planet itself. Conditions that once defined ancient seas, higher concentrations of certain elements, variations in oxygen levels, altered currents, could reappear in new combinations. The water may not return to exactly what it was, but it may begin to reflect states that feel closer to the distant past than to the present. Land, too, remains in transition. Continents continue to drift, though the movement is slow enough to seem still. Over time, these shifts alter coastlines, change the distribution of climates, and create environments that did not previously exist. Regions that are stable now may become more active, shaped by forces that have been building quietly beneath the surface. What emerges from these changes is not a single future, but a range of possibilities. The Earth does not move toward one outcome. It explores variations, shaped by interactions that extend across the entire system. Some environments may become more familiar, aligning with conditions that support existing ecosystems. Others may move in directions that feel less recognizable, creating spaces where life must adapt in new ways. This is where the sense of distance between past and future begins to dissolve. The strange environments of the ancient world no longer feel like anomalies that belonged only to a distant time. They begin to appear as expressions of processes that are still active, configurations that the planet is capable of returning to under certain conditions. The idea does not suggest a repetition in exact form. It suggests recurrence in principle. The same forces that once produced unfamiliar skies, dense oceans, and shifting landscapes are still present, still capable of shaping the environment in ways that may feel just as unusual when viewed from the perspective of the present. There is a quiet tension in this realization, because it challenges the sense of permanence that often defines how the current world is perceived. What feels stable may not remain so. What feels familiar may gradually shift into something else, not abruptly, but through continuous change that becomes noticeable only over time. And yet, there is also a sense of continuity. These changes are not disruptions from outside the system. They are part of the system itself, extensions of processes that have been unfolding since the earliest moments of the planet's history. The future does not arrive from nowhere. It grows out of what already exists. As these possibilities begin to take shape, they lead to another question, one that moves beyond the environment itself. If the conditions of the planet can change so significantly, if they can move towards states that once seemed distant or impossible, then the life within those environments will not remain unchanged. It will respond, adapt, and evolve in ways that may once again challenge everything that is expected. The environment shifts, slowly, almost imperceptibly, and life moves with it. It does not resist change for long. It adjusts, reshapes itself, and continues, just as it always has. The future of life does not arrive as a sudden transformation. It begins quietly, within the same processes that have always guided its development. There is no clear boundary where one form ends and another begins. Variation appears within populations, small differences that seem insignificant at first. These differences accumulate, influenced by conditions that are constantly shifting, even when those shifts are too subtle to notice. Over time, what was once variation becomes distinction, and what was once familiar begins to take on new forms. This process is not new. It is the same mechanism that shaped the earliest life on Earth, the same movement that produced forms that no longer exist. But now, it unfolds within a world that feels stable, making its presence less visible, less immediate. The scale has changed, but the direction remains open. What is often imagined as the future of life tends to focus on dramatic outcomes, on entirely new forms appearing suddenly, distinct from everything that came before. But the reality may be quieter. The next phase of life may not emerge as something easily recognized. It may already be present, embedded within existing systems, developing gradually in ways that do not stand out. In certain environments, this process becomes easier to observe. Microorganisms continue to evolve rapidly, responding to changes in chemistry, temperature, and pressure. They adapt to conditions that would seem extreme, forming communities that operate under rules that resemble those of the distant past. These changes are small, but they are continuous, shaping life at a pace that does not pause. Larger organisms follow the same process, though more slowly. Subtle adjustments in behavior, in structure, in interaction with the environment begin to shift the way species exist. These changes may not be visible within a single lifetime, but over longer periods they accumulate, leading to forms that diverge from what is currently known. This introduces a sense of uncertainty, but also possibility. The future of life is not fixed. It is not moving toward a predetermined outcome. It remains open, shaped by interactions that continue to evolve. The same forces that once produced unfamiliar organisms may still be guiding this process, influencing which paths are explored and which are left behind. There is something almost imperceptible in the way this unfolds. The beginning of change does not announce itself. It blends into what already exists, making it difficult to identify the moment when something new truly starts. What is seen as the present may already contain elements of what will come next, forming gradually beneath the surface of what is familiar. This leads to a question that does not resolve easily. If evolution continues to explore possibilities, if it has never stopped moving, then how much of the future is already here? How much of what will become visible later is already taking shape in forms that are too subtle to recognize? The idea lingers, not as a conclusion, but as an opening. The next phase of life does not need to be imagined as something distant. It may already exist, quietly developing within the systems that surround us, shaped by forces that have never ceased to act. And as this thought settles, the focus begins to shift once more. Because if life continues to evolve within these ongoing processes, then it becomes impossible to separate ourselves from them. The story is no longer only about the planet or the life that exists upon it. It begins to turn inward, toward the role of those who are observing it, those who are part of the same system, whether they recognize it or not. The story turns, slowly, toward those who are telling it, not away from the earth, but toward the way it is seen, interpreted, and understood. Humanity stands within the same system it seeks to explain, shaped by the same forces, yet attempting to observe them from a distance that may not truly exist. The past is reconstructed through fragments. Fossils are uncovered, preserved in layers of rock that hold traces of life that once existed. Each discovery adds detail, a shape, a structure, a suggestion of how organisms lived and interacted. Geological formations reveal shifts in environment. Chemical signatures point toward conditions that can no longer be directly experienced. From these pieces, a picture begins to form. It is a careful process, built on observation, testing, and refinement. Models are created to describe how life emerged, how it evolved, how the planet itself changed over time. These models bring clarity, organizing complexity into forms that can be understood, shared, and expanded upon. They allow the past to become something that can be approached, something that can be studied with precision. And yet, this understanding is always shaped by the perspective from which it is built. The tools used to observe the past define what can be seen. The concepts used to interpret it define how it is understood, what is recognized as important, what is categorized, what is explained, all depend on frameworks that exist within the present. These frameworks are powerful, but they are not complete. They reflect the knowledge available, the assumptions that guide interpretation, the boundaries of what can be measured and described. This introduces a subtle distance between what is observed and what is known. The evidence remains constant, but its meaning shifts depending on how it is viewed. A structure that appears simple under one interpretation may reveal complexity under another. A gap in the record may be seen as absence or as something that has not yet been fully recognized. The past, in this sense, becomes more than a record of what happened. It becomes a reflection of how it is approached. Each reconstruction carries within it the influence of the observer, shaped by the questions that are asked and the methods used to answer them. This does not diminish what has been learned. It deepens it. It reveals that understanding is not a fixed point, but a process that evolves alongside the knowledge it produces. As new discoveries are made, as new tools are developed, the picture shifts, expanding in ways that were not previously possible. There is something quiet and reflective in this realization. The search for origins is not only about uncovering the past, it is also about understanding the limits of perception, the ways in which observation is shaped by the one who observes. What is seen in the ancient world is influenced by what is known in the present. This creates a sense of connection that extends beyond simple curiosity. The story of the Earth is not separate from those who study it. It is interpreted through their perspective, their understanding, their place within the same system they are trying to describe. And as this perspective settles, another thought begins to emerge. If understanding is shaped by the tools and concepts that exist now, then there may be aspects of the past that remain beyond reach, not because they are hidden, but because they require ways of seeing that have not yet fully developed. The effort to understand the past moves forward with precision, yet it always meets a boundary that cannot be crossed. No matter how carefully the evidence is gathered, no matter how refined the methods become, there are limits that remain. They are not always visible at first, but they shape everything that can be known. Time is the first of these limits. It stretches across billions of years, far beyond direct experience. What remains from those distant periods is incomplete, shaped by what survived and what did not. Entire landscapes have been erased, transformed, or buried beneath layers that conceal what once existed. The further back the search goes, the fewer traces remain, and the more difficult it becomes to reconstruct what was once there. Scale introduces another boundary. Many of the processes that shaped the early Earth occurred at levels that are either too vast or too small to be fully observed. Geological movements unfold across distances that cannot be seen in a single view. Chemical interactions happen at scales that require interpretation rather than direct observation. The understanding of these processes depends on translating evidence into models, and those models, while powerful, are still representations rather than complete realities. There are also processes that leave no lasting trace. Events that occurred briefly, interactions that did not result in preserved structures, conditions that existed without forming records that could survive. These moments are not part of the evidence that can be studied. They exist outside of what can be recovered, shaping the past in ways that may never be fully known. Even when evidence is preserved, it is often fragmentary. A fossil may reveal the form of an organism, but not the full extent of how it lived. A chemical signature may suggest environmental conditions, but not the complete system in which those conditions existed. Each piece provides insight, but also leaves space that must be filled through interpretation. This creates a quiet tension within the process of understanding. The more that is discovered, the more it becomes clear that there are parts of the story that cannot be fully reconstructed. The picture becomes clearer in some areas, but the edges remain uncertain, shaped by gaps that may never be closed. These limits are not failures. They are part of the nature of studying something that extends so far beyond direct observation. They define the boundaries of knowledge, marking what can be approached and what remains beyond reach. Yet they also suggest something deeper, because if certain aspects of the past cannot be observed, if they leave no trace that can be recovered, then they still existed. They influenced the systems that followed, shaped the conditions that led to what can now be studied, even if their details are lost. Their absence from the record does not remove their impact. This introduces a subtle but powerful idea. What if the most important aspects of prehistoric Earth are not the ones that have been preserved, but the ones that have not? The processes that left no clear evidence, the interactions that cannot be directly traced, may have played a role that is only partially visible through what remains. The thought does not diminish what is known. It expands the sense of what remains unknown. It suggests that the story of the Earth is not only incomplete, but that it may always be incomplete, shaped by elements that cannot be fully recovered or described. There is a quiet acceptance in this realization. The search for understanding continues, but it does not move toward a final answer. It moves toward deeper questions, toward a recognition of the boundaries that define what can be known. And as these boundaries become clearer, the story itself begins to change. It no longer seeks to resolve every uncertainty. It begins to embrace them, to recognize that within the limits of observation, the questions themselves become part of what makes the story continue. The questions gather, but they do not resolve. They remain, suspended within a story that refuses to settle into a final shape. The search for understanding continues, yet it moves without the expectation of reaching a complete ending. The deeper the past is explored, the more it begins to feel like something that cannot be fully contained. The Earth does not present its history as a finished narrative. It does not offer a clear beginning that leads steadily toward a defined conclusion. Instead, it unfolds, layer by layer, process by process, without pause. Each moment connects to what came before and to what follows, forming a continuity that does not break into separate chapters as easily as it is often described. What has been uncovered so far reveals only part of that continuity. Fossils, geological structures, chemical traces, all contribute to a picture that grows more detailed over time. Yet, even as this picture expands, it remains incomplete. The boundaries of what can be known are always present, shaping the way the story is told. This incompleteness is not a flaw in the story. It is part of its nature. The Earth does not exist to be fully explained. It exists as a system that continues to evolve, carrying its past within its present, shaping its future in ways that extend beyond immediate perception. The story is not something that can be finished, because the processes that define it have not ended. There is a quiet shift in how this is understood. The goal is no longer to reach a final answer, to assemble every piece into a single, complete explanation. Instead, the focus begins to move toward something else. Toward the expansion of perspective, the recognition that each question opens into something larger rather than closing into certainty. The past becomes less of a destination and more of a space to explore. It offers insight, not in the form of definitive conclusions, but in the way it reshapes how the present is seen. The patterns, the systems, the changes that have been traced across time begin to influence how everything is understood, not as isolated events, but as part of an ongoing process. This perspective carries a sense of calm. The need for resolution softens, replaced by an awareness that the story does not depend on being complete. It continues regardless of whether it is fully understood. It moves forward, just as it always has, shaped by forces that do not pause for observation. There is also a sense of openness. The unknown is no longer something that must be filled or resolved. It becomes part of the story itself, an essential element that allows it to remain alive, to continue expanding beyond what is currently known. The limits of understanding do not close the narrative. They keep it from becoming fixed. In this way, the search for answers begins to take on a different meaning. It is not about reaching an endpoint, but about deepening awareness, about seeing more clearly the connections that extend across time. Each discovery does not conclude the story. It changes the way the story is experienced. The idea settles gently, almost quietly, The Earth's history is not something that can be completed. It is something that continues to unfold, regardless of how it is interpreted. What has been explored so far is part of that unfolding, but it is not separate from what is still to come. And as this realization lingers, it begins to shift the direction of the journey once more. Because if the story does not conclude, if it remains open and continuous, then the next step is not to look for an ending, but to look more deeply at what it means to exist within that story, to be part of a system that has never truly stopped evolving. The focus shifts once more, not to the planet itself, but to the way it is described. The past, as it is commonly understood, is arranged into sequences that feel clear and structured. Eras are defined, boundaries are drawn, and events are placed within timelines that move from one stage to another with a sense of order. These narratives create a path that can be followed, a way of seeing the history of the Earth as something that unfolds with direction and clarity. There is comfort in this structure. It allows complexity to become understandable, turning vast spans of time into segments that can be studied, compared, and explained. The early Earth becomes a beginning, followed by stages that lead toward the present, each one defined by changes that can be described and categorized. It creates a sense that the story is not only knowable, but organized in a way that can be fully grasped. And yet, beneath this structure, there is something less stable. The boundaries between these eras are not always as clear as they appear. They are drawn based on evidence that has been interpreted, often from fragments that suggest change, rather than define it precisely. The transitions between one stage and another may have been gradual, overlapping, or even inconsistent across different regions of the planet. The clean divisions that appear in narrative form may not reflect how those changes actually unfolded. The same is true for the events that define these timelines. They are often presented as sequences, as though one change leads directly into another. But the deeper the evidence is examined, the more it becomes clear that many of these processes occurred simultaneously, interacting in ways that are difficult to separate. The story becomes less linear, less contained within a single direction. What emerges is a recognition that the narratives used to describe the past are shaped by the need to create coherence. They are not incorrect, but they are simplified. They organize complexity into forms that can be understood, but in doing so, they may smooth over details that do not fit neatly within the structure. This does not mean that the story is false. It means that it is partial, shaped by perspective, by the limits of observation, and by the ways in which information is interpreted. The past itself does not present a finished narrative. It is reconstructed, assembled from pieces that are arranged in ways that make sense within the frameworks that exist. There is a quiet tension in this realization, because the more the story is refined, the more it begins to reveal its own boundaries. The clarity that makes it accessible also creates a filter, guiding attention toward what fits within the established structure and away from what does not. This filtering is not intentional. It is part of how understanding works. Patterns are recognized, connections are made, and coherence is formed. But within that process, certain possibilities may be set aside, not because they are invalid, but because they are more difficult to integrate into the existing narrative. The result is a version of the past that feels complete, even when it is not. It offers a sense of resolution, a belief that the major elements have been understood. Yet beneath that surface, uncertainty remains, not as an error, but as a reflection of the complexity that cannot be fully captured. As this perspective settles, the story begins to shift once more. It becomes less about what has been established, and more about what may lie beyond those boundaries. The question is no longer only how the past is understood, but what might be missing from that understanding. What details have yet to be recognized? What possibilities remain just outside the structures that have been created? The story continues to unfold, yet certain spaces remain untouched, not because they have been overlooked, but because they cannot be reached. These spaces exist within the record itself, woven into the very structure of what has been preserved. They are not empty in the sense of being unimportant. They are empty because something once there did not remain. Fossils, often seen as direct windows into the past, carry their own silences. They preserve form, but rarely the full context of existence. Soft tissues disappear, behaviors leave no clear imprint, and entire interactions vanish without trace. What remains is only a fragment, a moment captured under specific conditions that allowed it to endure. Countless other moments, equally real, are lost entirely. Geological records follow the same pattern. Layers of rock record, changes in environment, shifts in chemistry, movements of the planet. Yet these layers are not continuous. They are interrupted, eroded, transformed by processes that overwrite what came before. Entire chapters of Earth's history may have been removed, leaving only hints that something once existed where nothing can now be clearly seen. Time deepens these gaps. The further back the search extends, the more incomplete the record becomes. Early processes, especially those that did not produce durable structures, may have left no trace that can be recovered. The beginnings of systems, the subtle transitions that shaped them, may exist only as influences on what followed, without direct evidence of how they unfolded. This absence is not accidental. It is part of the way the planet changes. Preservation is selective, shaped by conditions that favor certain forms over others. What survives is not a complete record, but a filtered one, determined by chance, by environment, by processes that are not concerned with future observation. There is a quiet shift that occurs when this is fully considered. The gaps are no longer seen as temporary, waiting to be filled by future discoveries. They begin to appear as permanent features, boundaries that define what can and cannot be known. No matter how advanced the tools become, some parts of the past may remain beyond reconstruction. This does not diminish the story. It transforms it. The unknown becomes part of the narrative itself, not as a problem to be solved, but as an essential element that shapes how the story is understood. What cannot be seen still influences what can be observed, creating a presence that is felt even in its absence. The idea carries a sense of depth that extends beyond simple uncertainty. It suggests that the past is not only incomplete, but that its incompleteness is meaningful. The missing pieces are not just gaps in knowledge. They are reminders that the system being explored is larger than what can be fully captured. As this perspective settles, the focus begins to shift away from the expectation of completeness. The story no longer aims to assemble every detail into a finished form. It begins to acknowledge that some aspects of Earth's history may never be fully understood, not because they are hidden, but because they have not remained in a way that allows them to be recovered. There is a calm acceptance in this realization. The unknown is not something that stands outside the story. It exists within it, shaping its boundaries, influencing its form. It is part of what gives the narrative its depth, its openness, its sense of something that extends beyond what can be fully described. And as these gaps become more visible, they begin to suggest something even more subtle. The picture that has been assembled from what remains may not just be incomplete. It may be shaped by what is missing, influenced by the absence of elements that once played a role but can no longer be seen, altering the way the entire story appears. The fragments remain, carefully studied, arranged into forms that feel coherent, yet something essential always stays just beyond reach. The past, as it is known, exists through reconstruction, built from what has survived, interpreted through what can be understood. But beneath this process lies a quiet truth that becomes harder to ignore the deeper it is considered. What is reconstructed is not the past itself. It is an approximation, a translation of something that can no longer be directly experienced. The ancient Earth, in its full presence, existed in a way that cannot be fully recovered. Its atmosphere was not only a composition of gases, but something that could be felt, breathed, perceived in ways that no longer exist. Its oceans were not only chemical systems, but environments with textures, movements, and interactions that cannot be completely captured through data alone. The life that existed within those environments cannot be fully restored either. Fossils reveal form, but not motion. They suggest structure, but not behavior in its entirety. The way organisms interacted, the subtle exchanges that defined their existence, the rhythms of their environments, all of these remain beyond direct reconstruction. Even the most detailed models remain interpretations. They bring the past closer, but they do not recreate it. They rely on assumptions, on patterns that are inferred from limited evidence, on frameworks that are shaped by present understanding. They offer insight, but they do not restore the full reality of what once was. There is a distance that cannot be closed. Time does not preserve experience in its entirety. It filters, it removes, it transforms. What remains is only what could survive. what could be carried forward through processes that were never intended to retain a complete record. The result is a past that is always partially hidden, not because it is being concealed, but because it cannot be fully brought back. This realization introduces a profound shift. The goal is no longer to fully reconstruct the ancient world as it truly was. That goal, while compelling, may not be possible. Instead, what exists is a relationship with the past that is shaped by imagination as much as by evidence. Imagination does not replace knowledge. It extends it. It allows the fragments to be seen as part of something larger, something that cannot be fully assembled, but can be approached in ways that move beyond strict reconstruction. It fills the spaces that cannot be measured, not with certainty, but with possibility. It recognizes that the ancient earth was more than the sum of its preserved parts. There is something both humbling and expansive in this idea. It removes the expectation that the past can be fully known, while opening the possibility that it can be experienced in a different way. Not through exact replication, but through a deeper awareness of what cannot be fully captured. The story shifts once more. It becomes less about recovering a fixed reality, and more about engaging with something that remains partially beyond reach. The past is no longer a puzzle that can be completed. It is something that can only be approached, explored, and imagined within the limits of what remains. And as this perspective settles, it carries the story forward, not toward an ending, but toward something more open. Because if the true nature of the ancient earth cannot be fully reconstructed, then the journey does not conclude with understanding. It continues, expanding into new ways of seeing, new ways of questioning, and new ways of connecting with a reality that has never been entirely lost, only transformed beyond complete recognition. The movement slows, not because it has reached an end, but because it no longer needs to push forward. The questions remain, the patterns linger, the possibilities continue to unfold, yet something begins to soften. The story does not close, it settles. The earth continues as it always has. It turns without pause, carrying oceans, land, and life through a motion that does not announce itself. The forces beneath the surface remain active, the atmosphere shifts, the currents move, and life adapts in ways that are rarely noticed. Nothing has stopped, nothing has concluded. And yet, there is a quiet that returns, a stillness that feels almost unchanged from the beginning. This stillness is not empty. It carries everything that has been explored. The unfamiliar environments, the strange life forms, the hidden systems, the patterns that stretch across time, all of it remains present within the same world that now feels calm and steady. The complexity does not disappear. It becomes part of the silence. There is no final answer waiting within this quiet. No single explanation that gathers everything into certainty. The deeper the story has moved, the more it has opened, revealing layers that extend beyond what can be fully understood. The search for clarity has not failed. It has simply revealed the limits of what can be resolved. The past remains where it has always been. It does not rise to the surface in a way that can be fully grasped. It exists within the systems that continue to move, within the patterns that repeat, within the processes that never stopped. It is present, but not fully visible, known, but not completely understood. This creates a sense of continuity that does not require conclusion. The story does not need to end to be complete in its own way. It continues, just as the planet continues, carrying its history forward without separating it from the present. What has been explored becomes part of this ongoing movement, not something that stands apart from it. The silence deepens, but it changes in meaning. What once felt like absence now feels filled, shaped by everything that has been considered. It holds the questions that remain unanswered, the possibilities that extend beyond what can be confirmed, the recognition that understanding does not close the story, but expands it. There is a calm in this realization. The need for final answers begins to fade, replaced by an acceptance that some aspects of the Earth's history and of its present will remain open. The unknown is not something that interrupts the story. It is part of what allows it to continue. The same quiet that existed before the story began returns, but it is no longer the same. It carries depth, shaped by the journey that has unfolded. It holds within it the sense that the world is larger than what can be fully described, that its processes extend beyond what can be completely observed. Nothing announces this realization. It does not arrive as a conclusion. It settles gently, almost imperceptibly, as the movement of the earth continues without pause. The oceans shift, the air moves, the land changes, and life persists within it all, following patterns that remain partly hidden. And within this stillness, something remains, not as an answer, but as a presence. A quiet understanding that the story has not ended, that it never needed to end, and that the silence itself is not empty, but filled with everything that has been, everything that is, and everything that has yet to unfold. The silence remains, but it no longer feels like something that needs to be filled. It holds space, not as absence, but as something that invites attention without demanding resolution. The questions that have unfolded throughout the journey do not press for answers. They settle into a different role, becoming part of the experience rather than problems to be solved. There is a shift that begins to take place within this quiet. The unknown, once something that seemed incomplete, begins to feel expansive. It opens outward, allowing the mind to move freely through possibilities that are not limited by certainty. What cannot be fully explained does not weaken the story. It deepens it, giving it room to extend beyond fixed boundaries. The past, in this sense, is not defined only by what can be known. It is shaped equally by what cannot be fully recovered, by the spaces where evidence fades and interpretation reaches its limits. These spaces are not empty. They are filled with potential, with the recognition that the Earth's history is larger than any single explanation can contain. This realization softens the need for conclusion. The search for understanding continues, but it changes in nature. It becomes less about arriving at a final point and more about moving through the process itself. Each question leads to another, not as a failure to resolve, but as a natural unfolding of curiosity. There is something calming in this movement. It removes the pressure to define everything, to place each piece into a complete and unchanging structure. Instead, it allows the story to remain open, to continue expanding as new perspectives emerge. The unknown becomes part of what keeps the story alive, part of what allows it to remain dynamic rather than fixed. Imagination begins to take on a different role within this space. It does not replace evidence, but it moves alongside it, exploring what cannot be directly observed. It allows the mind to engage with the past in ways that extend beyond strict reconstruction, to consider possibilities that remain just outside the reach of certainty. This does not mean that anything can be assumed. It means that the limits of knowledge create room for exploration, for a kind of understanding that is not confined to what can be fully proven. It becomes a balance between what is known and what is possible, between observation and reflection. The meaning of the story begins to shift. It is no longer centered on what can be concluded. It is found within the process of seeking, within the way each layer of understanding reveals something new while leaving something else open. The value is not only in the answers that are found, but in the movement toward them. There is a quiet sense of continuity in this idea. The Earth itself does not reach a final state. It continues to change, to evolve, to move through processes that have no clear endpoint. In the same way, the understanding of its history does not conclude. It follows the same pattern, extending forward without needing to close. As this perspective settles, the unknown becomes less distant. It is no longer something that stands apart from what is understood. It becomes part of the same landscape, shaping the way the story is experienced. It adds depth, not by providing answers, but by allowing the story to remain open. And in that openness, there is a sense of quiet clarity. The mystery of the Earth's past is not something that needs to be solved in order to have meaning. It is something that can be experienced, something that continues to unfold, inviting attention without requiring resolution, and carrying the story forward in ways that do not depend on reaching an end. The movement never stops. It does not pause at the edge of understanding, nor does it gather itself into a final moment that can be held and defined. It continues, just as it always has, carrying everything forward without separating what has been from what is still unfolding. The Earth turns quietly, unchanged in its motion, yet never the same from one moment to the next. Beneath the surface, heat rises, currents shift, and structures adjust in ways that do not call attention to themselves. The atmosphere moves, the oceans circulate, and life continues to respond, adapting in patterns that stretch across time without interruption. Nothing announces this continuation. There is no signal that marks where the story should end. The processes that shaped the earliest environments are still present, still active, still influencing the world in ways that remain partly unseen. What once seemed distant now feels closer, not because it has returned, but because it never fully left. The idea of a beginning begins to soften. The early Earth, often imagined as a starting point, becomes part of a flow that does not have a clear origin. Each moment emerges from what came before, shaped by processes that extend further back than can be fully traced. The story does not begin in a single place. It unfolds from a continuity that has always been in motion. The same is true of endings. There is no final stage where everything resolves into stillness, no point where the processes stop and the story concludes. Instead, there is only transition, movement from one state into another, from one form into the next, without a boundary that separates them completely. What has been explored remains within this flow. The strange environments, the unfamiliar life, the hidden patterns, and the unanswered questions all become part of the same ongoing system. They do not stand apart as isolated chapters. They exist within the continuity, shaping it in ways that extend beyond what can be fully observed. There is a quiet sense of scale in this realization. The story of the Earth is not something that can be contained within a single perspective. It extends beyond individual moments, beyond the limits of observation, into processes that continue regardless of whether they are fully understood. And within this scale, there is also a sense of closeness. The same forces that shaped the distant past are still present, still acting within the world that exists now. The boundary between then and now becomes less distinct, replaced by a continuity that carries everything forward. The silence returns once more, but it is no longer empty. It holds within it the weight of everything that has been considered, everything that has been questioned, and everything that remains open. It does not provide answers. It does not resolve uncertainty. It simply remains, steady and unchanged, as the processes of the Earth continue within it. There is something gentle in this ending that is not an ending, a recognition that the story does not need to conclude in order to have meaning. It continues, not toward a final point, but through an unfolding that has no clear boundary. And as the silence settles, it carries with it a final thought that does not close the journey, but leaves it open. The story of the Earth is not something that began in the past or will end in the future. It is something that continues, always present, always moving, existing beyond the need for a beginning or an end, quietly unfolding in a way that can be observed, but never fully contained.